Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 12, The Sleepover. "Oh, Marilla," Anne said one February evening, "tomorrow is Diana's birthday. Her mother said I can spend the night in the spare room. Before that, we're going to the school concert. Oh, please say you'll let me go, Marilla." Marilla finally agreed. The next night, Anne and Diana drove to the concert in a sleigh with Diana's cousins. Anne loved every performance except one. When Gilbert Blythe began his poem, Anne read a book until he had finished. The girls got back to Diana's house late. Everybody seemed to be asleep. The girls tiptoed into the long parlor next to the spare room. "Let's change in here," said Diana. "It's nice and warm." They put on their nightgowns. Then Anne said, "Let's race to see who gets to bed first." The girls ran through the parlor and through the spare room door. They jumped on the bed at the same time. Something moved under the covers. There was a gasp and a cry. A voice said, "Merciful goodness!" Anne and Diana raced back out of the room and up the stairs. "Who or what was that?" whispered Anne. "It was Aunt Josephine," Diana said, laughing. "She's Father's aunt from Charlottetown. She's 70 and very prim and proper. Well, we'll have to sleep with Minnie May, and she kicks." Miss Josephine Barry did not come to breakfast the next morning. After breakfast, Anne hurried home. In the afternoon, she went to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand. "So you and Diana scared poor old Miss Barry half to death last night," Mrs. Lynde said. "Diana's mother told me that old Miss Barry has a terrible temper. She wouldn't speak to Diana at all." "It wasn't Diana's fault," Anne said. "It was mine. I suggested racing to see who would get into bed first." "I knew it had to be your idea," said Mrs. Lynde. "Well, it's made a lot of trouble. Miss Barry was going to stay a month, but now she's leaving tomorrow. She had promised to pay for Diana's music lessons, but she's changed her mind. The Barrys are very upset. Miss Barry is rich, and they want to stay on her good side." Anne ran over to Diana's house. Diana met her at the kitchen door. "I heard that Miss Barry is very angry and won't stay," Anne said. "Why didn't you tell her it was my fault?" "Oh, I could never do that," Diana said. "I'm not a tattletale. Anyhow, I was just as much to blame as you." "Well, I'm going to tell Miss Barry myself," Anne said. She walked up to the sitting room door and knocked. "Come in," a voice said sharply. Anne entered the room. Miss Josephine Barry was sitting by the fire knitting. She glared at Anne through her gold-rimmed glasses. "Who are you?" Miss Barry demanded. "I'm Anne of Green Gables," said Anne, "and I've come to confess." "Confess what?" Miss Barry snapped. "That it was all my fault about jumping into bed on you," Anne said. "It was my idea to jump into bed, so you mustn't blame Diana." "Oh, I mustn't, eh?" said Miss Barry. "Well, Diana did her share of the jumping." "Oh, it was only in fun," Anne said. "I think you ought to forgive us. Anyway, please forgive Diana and let her have her music lessons. If you have to be mad at someone, be mad at me." Miss Barry stopped glaring. "How would you like it if you were woken up out of a sound sleep by two girls jumping on you?" she asked. "It must have been terrible," said Anne. "But imagine how we felt, Miss Barry. We didn't know anybody was in that bed. You scared us too, and we couldn't sleep in the spare room after being promised. You're probably used to speaking in spare rooms, but what if you were a little orphan girl who was going to sleep in a spare room for the very first time?" Miss Barry began to laugh. "I'm afraid my imagination is a little rusty," she said. "It's been so long since I used it. Now sit down and tell me about yourself." "Oh, I'm sorry I can't," Anne said. "I have to go home, but before I go, I wish you would forgive Diana, and I wish you would stay." Miss Barry smiled. "Maybe I will if you'll come over and talk to me." That evening, Miss Barry told Diana's parents that she had unpacked her bag. "I've made up my mind to stay," she said. "I want to know that Anne girl better. She makes me laugh." Miss Barry stayed even longer than a month, and when she finally left, she said, "Remember, Anne girl, when you come to town, you're to visit me. You can sleep in my very best spare room bed."